Welcome back. Now that we've covered how Chef Automate can help us address our patching needs, let's take a look at a practical example. For this demonstration, I'm going to be taking on the role as an administrator for the fictitious website Planet Express. And what we do at Planet Express is sell framed prints of NASA satellite imagery. We think it's going to be huge. Planet Express is already making use of Chef Automate and has started their automation journey. And we can see here in visibility that I have a number of nodes already checking in with Chef. And what Automate allows me to do is see exactly what changes Chef made every time that machine checked in, effectively providing me an audit trail of change on my systems. We're also making use of compliance. Right now you can see I have 4 nodes checking in, and all of them are passing their compliance controls. Just as we could with our Chef visibility, we can take a look at the details of our compliance runs here and see exactly what profiles are being run against each machine. In this case, we are evaluating my Planet Express SSL profile, which is checking to make sure that we're running safe SSL versions and protocols, ensuring that we are not susceptible to things like the Poodle vulnerability. However, you'll notice that we are not yet checking our patch level, and that's what we're going to start doing today. We already have, if we take another look at the nodes here, and let's grab our delivered box, you can take a look at a run list here to see what's being applied to these nodes. Currently, there are 3 cookbooks in this node's run list. We're running the default recipe out of BJC Bass, which is a wrapper cookbook, just setting node attributes for my systems and installing some prerequisite software. There's BJC e-commerce, which is the cookbook that's responsible for deploying this lovely site. And we have Patching Demo, which is the cookbook responsible for making sure we're running our most up-to-date patches. So my expectation is that these machines are already patched, but we're not actually checking our work yet. So that's where we're going to start. If we hop back into compliance here and go into profiles, you can see the one profile that I'm already running, that Planet Express SSL TLS baseline. And in here we can go ahead and take a look at the details of each of these controls and how they're formed. What we also have access to are these 82 available profiles. These are profiles that are included with an Automate license and are mostly based around the Center for Internet Security's Level 1 and Level 2 benchmarks for various operating systems. What you'll also see here in this list is we have a couple of profiles called the patch benchmarks. There is the DevSec Linux patch benchmark and a Windows version of same. Since my systems are running Ubuntu, I'm going to be interested in this Linux patch benchmark, which will check first to see that our operating system is up to date, and Inspect provides some easy-to-use resources for that. And in the cases that our system is not up to date, it'll provide us a list of each package that requires an update. To start using this profile, all I need to do is click Get up here, which will grab the latest version of that profile and install it on my Automate server so that I can start using it in my scans. Now at Planet Express, we're also making use of workflow to make sure that every change we want to introduce to our systems is able to be pushed through a pipeline so that we can test and validate those changes before we take them live in our production environments. And as you can see here, there's already a change sitting and waiting for me in my patching demo project. We'll get into what all of these stages are, but right now all we're interested in is this approve box. I see there's one change ready to approve, and that's what we're going to have a look at. So our colleague Philip has already pushed a change, and the first thing that happens when we submit a change that runs through this verify stage, we run some automated unit testing, lint checkers, and syntax checkers to make sure this change is looking good before we take one of our colleagues' times for code review. There we go. I can do that review right here from this console. So if we hop into the review tab here, I can see a summary of what change has been submitted. In particular, we've updated the attributes for this cookbook to update the audit profiles we want to run. This is because what we're using in our environment to run these compliance scans is a cookbook available on the Chef Supermarket called Audit, which allows us to define a list of compliance profiles that we want our nodes to run every time they check in with Chef, and define where we want it to send the output of those profiles. In this case, to that Chef Automate compliance dashboard. And we're making sure that Leela Linux patch baseline profile we just installed gets added to the list. Since we're making a change to our cookbook, we also updated the version of that cookbook. So this change looks good to me. Go ahead and add a helpful comment before we approve our change and start evaluating it further. Now, the rest of this pipeline is consisting of 5 further stages: build, acceptance, union, rehearsal, and delivered, which will first prepare my new cookbook for publish to the Chef server, and then start deploying my change to progressively more production-like environments so that I can evaluate how this change affects my systems before taking them live. Right now, build is going to rerun my unit lint and syntax checks, make sure that everything is still looking good, and then get ready to deploy to my acceptance environment to make sure that this update doesn't break anything. It shouldn't. All we're doing is changing what compliance profiles we run, but now that we're actually checking our Linux patch baseline, we can see whether or not my cookbook is actually doing what I expect it to be doing once acceptance checks in. If we head back to the dashboard here, we can see an aggregate view of all the changes that might be running through our pipeline. Right now, we're not too busy. I'm the only one in here. We can see the last change that was delivered, an arbitrary change I pushed to another project to make sure things were working. Spoiler alert, they are. And now we can see, as our patching demo project gets evaluated, the view up top will update live as we've just completed build and are on our way to moving to acceptance. This is when we'll actually start deploying our updates to our systems and see whether or not my machines are as compliant as they hope they are. All right, it looks like acceptance is running, so let's hop back in here. What's important to note is that while there is a very rigid structure to the shape of this work, no matter what you are evaluating, every pipeline is going to have these same 6 stages and 2 human gates. We saw the first one earlier, the approval gate. And once acceptance completes, it will wait for us once again to evaluate that environment and make sure that we want to deliver this change the rest of the way through our pipeline. As rigid as this shape is, the pipeline itself is still very flexible because the individual phases that run are completely customizable. If we take a look, for example, at what's happening during our deploy here, I can see a full audit trail of the steps workflow is taking. Every time a new phase is reached, we first reach out to the first available build node or runner in our environment, which are machines responsible for actually executing whatever deployment tasks, tests, etc. I want to submit. The way that those are done are via Chef cookbooks. So what we'll actually see in the rest of this output is the results of a Chef client run, where it detects the appropriate phase that we're in and runs a corresponding recipe out of a special type of cookbook called a build cookbook to take whatever actions have been defined. Here, I'm using a build cookbook called Delivery Truck, which is the stock build cookbook that Chef has produced to help make deploying cookbook artifacts easier. The way that I'm deploying, since I have a long-lived environment, is using a feature called push jobs to trigger a Chef client run on any machine that's part of the environment associated with this stage. In this case, that Chef client run happened on my ecom acceptance server. Uh-oh. If we hop back in here, I can see that once deploy completes, we run some testing. I haven't created any special smoke tests yet, so I've opted to just skip that phase, which workflow allows me to do to speed up the pipeline. But we can see here I have some failures in functional. And indeed, since my machines are checking their audit state every time Chef client checks in, this is simply querying my compliance endpoint to see whether or not the result of that deploy completed with a successful compliance run. And indeed, while the deploy completed successfully, we haven't actually changed the configs of our systems. Now that we've changed our compliance setup, I'm getting failed scans. If we want to figure out the nature of these, we can hop right back to the compliance console and whoops, looks like we have some failures in that ring now. If we go into our node view here, I can see that ecom acceptance is now failing its compliance runs. And now in the scan results, what we see are Planet Express SSL is still passing just fine. But now that we have started evaluating the Linux patch baseline, I can see that we have some failures to deal with. First up, checks to see whether Linux is up to date, and says, no, it is not. So now I can see exactly what the damage is, and whoo boy, looks like my system is quite out of date with what versions are available in my package repositories. All right, so I have a problem to solve before I take this any further. In order to figure out how to solve those problems, we are going to submit a new change to our patching demo project to make sure that we are actually updating packages the way we think we are. I already have patching demo checked out of my version control. I'm sitting on the master branch. Before I do anything else, I'm going to go ahead and make sure I pull the most up-to-date version of my code. Alrighty. Now we're going to check out a new branch. And open up our code in our text editor of choice. I'm going to go ahead and use Atom. And if we take a look at the patching demo cookbook here, here's the attributes file we saw earlier, and that's all looking good. Although, apparently, Cookstyle does not like some of my syntax. No worries, something for a later revision. For today, though, we're going to take a look at what the default recipe is doing, because I was expecting it to update all my packages. Aha! It looks like we're updating the cache from our repository, but have commented out the recipe that actually upgrades everything. That explains a thing or two as to why I wasn't seeing the behavior I expected. But at the very least, that should be a pretty easy change to make. Now that we've made that change, I can confirm that indeed we do have a file modified that we'll need to update. So I'm going to go ahead and commit that change. Let's actually update things. Now, at this point would typically be when I push my change to a remote origin. However, since I'm using workflow, we actually have a command line utility that will start the process of getting that merge ready. Instead of doing a git push, I'm going to run delivery review. And since I want to make sure that we are cutting a new version here, I'm also going to pass it the -a flag, which will auto-increment the version number in my metadata file to make sure I don't overwrite an existing cookbook. Once we run that, we can see that a new run through our pipeline is beginning, currently evaluating unit, lint, and syntax to make sure I haven't broken anything syntactically in the change I've proposed. Since we still have this failure sitting in our pipeline, once this change makes it through, it will supplant this let's start checking our patch level change and combine the two, assuming acceptance goes well and we want to push this change further. All right. It looks like verify has completed. And just as before, we can always go and review and ensure that we have the change that we expect, and of course, a bump to our version. What you'll see here in the background is that behind the scenes, Automate created a new commit for me for the version bump. So we can actually break up the actual commit I made plus the one that was auto-created for us to increment the version. Now, when we hit approve, we're going to start this whole process again. The change will get merged into our repo, and we will start the chain of building and publishing our cookbook and deploying to acceptance. As before, we can go ahead and track what's going on in this dashboard here as our change makes its way through. Another thing that's worth noting, since we actually are making a change to what is being configured on our machines here, when we finish deploying our changes, we'll be able to see that those updates were applied not only via the resources that get run on the Chef client run, but if all goes well, we should once again see a nice unbroken blue circle of passing compliance scans. Let's see how we're doing. Change is making its way through build and is now getting ready to publish to the Chef server. And what's worth noting is that even as we publish this to the Chef server, we're making use of a feature in Chef called environmental version constraints, which means that even though this new code is available to my nodes, each environment has very strict constraints as to which versions of that cookbook they're allowed to consume. Until we get to the associated provision phase of any of these stages, those environments will keep pulling the already known good versions of those cookbooks. and will only start consuming the new ones after they have passed the appropriate stage of this workflow. All right, the provision is complete and the deploy is happening. And as before, I'm hoping that the deploy is going to not have any failures. Now that we're actually making a change, this is where we might start seeing failures in deploy as we've changed the way our systems are being built or updated. If all that goes well, we'll continue forward to that functional stage, and it's my hope that this time around we'll get a clean bill of health and can move our change further down the line. We'll still have to evaluate whether, even if we're successful at updating our patches, our site still functions. Since at the end of the day, if my customers can't purchase our prints, it doesn't matter whether I'm using the most up-to-date patches, I'm still in trouble. Okay, so now our deploy is completed successfully, and this time around, it looks like my functional test is happy with me. I can always check my work though, make sure nothing crazy happened, like it stopped checking patch level or something like that. But hey, 2 pass profiles. This time around, Linux patch baseline is happy with me. Excellent. So we've reached the point where we can take this one step further. And if we hop back into workflow now, we can see that this change is ready to be delivered. So now, once I am satisfied that things look good, we go ahead and we click Deliver. You'll notice that this contains our new change, and also now we've hit the union stage. So how does union differ from acceptance? Well, part of it is that union is going to be a little bit closer to my production environment in design than acceptance was, but union is also where we start processing dependencies for the first time. One of the features of these workflow pipelines is that we can actually tie them together. And we can see here, if we look at the high level of our patching demo pipeline, not only do we see the full history of change that's been promoted through this pipeline, but we can also see which projects require it. And here we see that BJC e-commerce, the pipeline responsible for deploying my site, depends on patching demo. If we go into that project, we can see the same dependency relationship mapped out the other way around. This time it says dependencies instead of required by. What that means is, whenever a change to patching demo makes its way to union, it needs to not only properly deploy and test the patching pipeline, but also any downstream dependencies. And this is where we're checking the thing we really care about. If we update these packages, are we going to disrupt the behavior of our actual production application? We're going to find that out in union for the first time. First, it's going to deploy for the patching demo project, and then it's going to go through a whole nother round of these same 4 steps: provision, deploy, smoke, and functional, not only for patching demo, but for the downstream BJC e-commerce project. All right. Now that the initial deploy has completed, you'll notice that union has not completed and moved on to rehearsal, but provision has started rerunning. What's happening here? As mentioned, now that patching demo itself has been validated, we need to also validate BJC e-commerce. Union does not pass unless all downstream projects of the ones we're changing also pass their deploys and their tests. That way we know before we move on to our more sensitive environments and start getting ready to deploy to our production environments, we still have everything tested and safe. So we can be confident that that change is ready for prime time. Provision should wrap up pretty quickly here, and then we'll do our final deploy and functional tests, and then the moment of truth. We get to see whether A, we have actually fixed our patching problem in union as well, and B, whether or not our site still loads as we expect it to. And again, we see here, now that provision is complete, deploy is doing the very same thing. All right. With our deploy complete, functional reruns, and gets a clean bill of health across the board. We can see our deploy has already moved forward to rehearsal here. Moment of truth, though. Are my tests trustworthy? Does Planet Express still load in Union? It does. I can still go and grab a project, or a print rather, add it to my cart, and start checking out. And business carries on even after, well, if I were to log in anyway, even after making some updates to my system. And indeed, when we look at compliance now, we see a clean bill of health in Union, and most importantly, we see that it's checking not just Planet Express SSL, but Linux patch baseline, just as we expect. This time around, since the Linux update is indeed up to date, we didn't have to go and find which ones are out of date because there's no patches to inspect. All's clear, and now we can make our way safely on through to rehearsal and delivered. Thanks for joining us. I hope you've enjoyed this presentation. And if you'd like to take a look at what that patching cookbook looks like, I do have it available on GitHub, as well as my presentation deck. And you can see, if we actually look at the contents of that upgrade recipe, well, it's just doing that dist upgrade we saw before, with the extra "yes, I really mean it" flags. Thanks for joining us.